in a moment.
Well, the U.S. is so good at generating bad news about itself that it's hard for people in the rest of the world to miss it. So it does have an effect.
Hey.
Oh, that's absolutely.
Elisabeth, Tom, John, very good to have you with us. Welcome to Freedom Games.
Hello. Hi, John. I didn't say hi to you earlier. Nice to see you.
How are you doing?
Hi, John.
Very well.
Hello, how's life?
Very good to have you with at the event of the liberal worlds in Poland. This is the main event uniting all the freedom lovers in Poland with lots of people attending. Multiple panels. This panel of ours is a very specific one. It's devoted to the question again, the future of liberal world, but what it would be without the media. And now we're thinking, we're seeing the shrinking media space in Central Europe. We are asking our questions to you also, but we'll have a general open discussion about how to ensure free and informed societies against this backdrop. Let me begin by introducing you very briefly. Of course, everybody reads about your excellent accomplishments so far, and you're very present in today's debates across the globe, really, definitely in the Western world. Elisabeth, you're connecting from United States. You're a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, previously in the UK with the Royal United Services Institute, where you started basically programs on hybrid threats, let's say, broadly speaking. And with the background in journalism, you have been and you are continuously present in the global debates on the situation regarding disinformation, but also the situation of media. Notably, and I do recommend this book, it's an excellent book, God's Spies. This is a recent publication of yours, and it's really worth the read, examining the role of espionage and the church in the 20th century. John Lloyd, with whom we will be in a moment in Romania, really, at another fantastic forum, the Ratio LSE Ideas Forum, is editor of the Financial Times. He has many years of experience of in journalism, but also very strong focus on and very present mission to educate and to lift up the Central European media professionals and journalists. In the forum that I mentioned, John is leading for a number of years already, together with LSE Ideas and the Ratio Foundation, masterclass. So really looking into the problems and challenges of Central European journalism today. And
just one thing before you carry on. It's very nice, the introduction, but I was never editor of the FT. I was editor of the Weekend magazine and Moscow bureau chief. I'd hate the present editor to think I was a gazumpinger.
I will not. Okay, I will not then misplace it anymore. But now moving to Tom Kent has been the editor-in-chief or the director of Radio Free Europe when he was stationed also in Prague for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and also for a number of years with Associated Press. Correct me if I'm getting anything wrong here. But also on the topic of today's discussion, Tom has authored and has spent long time studying the response to disinformation and the condition of media and civil society across Central Eastern Europe, writing a book that you can find also online. It's an excellent study in covert and overt tactics of combating Russian disinformation in the space of Central Eastern Europe. So great to have you all here. And let me paint just the picture to begin the discussion. we are in Central Europe, and specifically where, with Visegrad Inside, we focus specifically on the Central Europe, meaning the Visegrad countries, plus we're looking at now over the 10 last years at a shrinking media space with more than 500 outlets in Hungary taken over by the government media, which maybe wouldn't be a problem from the point of view of disinformation, if not for the fact that in Hungary, you do not need Sputnik or Russia Today to hear the messages of the Russian of Kremlin in the public space, specifically coming from the government-controlled media. As the report of the Oxford Reuters Institute finds, and I forgot to mention that John was one of the founders of the institute. There is the return of Radio Free Europe, which isn't for me a good sign. Radio Free Europe returned to Hungary, returned to Bulgaria, returned to Romania, which altogether, these are NATO states, EU countries, which also gives a strong signal saying something is wrong with freedom of information, freedom of media in Central Europe. And then we have worrying signals about Poland, Slovenia. We have oligarchs controlling Czechia, including Prime Minister. Czechia media space is nearly all belonging to the oligarchs with some bad problems. Slovak journalist has been killed not so long ago. That all only awakened the society. So tell me, is it just Central Europe? Or global media has a bigger problem and we're losing on the disinformation war? Or maybe it's the other way around, and actually it's a prime time for journalism across the globe. What do you think? What's your impressions? Elisabeth, what's your take?
Well, I'd like to be an optimist. Maybe we are at an inflection point, but big changes often involve convulsions. And we are definitely in a stage of convulsion because it's not clear exactly how people are supposed to get their information. And that is the major change, I think, where we have moved from the stage where reading the newspaper, listening to public service, television, radio is what you do. And now, compared to today, where not only do we have a great multitude of news outlets that in the past would simply not have been viable, and that also do not really employ journalists, but simply load content of varying quality and sometimes terrible quality. So it's we are in what you might call a Hobbesian state of news dissemination with complete lack of clarity as when it comes to who is supposed to disseminate information and how much trust are we supposed to place in that information. And that is terrible, not just because it devalues the professional journalist who does play a decisive role in our society. If it's not clear that you even need to be a journalist to disseminate information, what is this whole trade about of highly qualified people? But it's not just a tragedy from that point of view, but it's a tragedy because incomplete or false information has consequences in real life. And that's what we saw on the 6th of January in Washington. That's what we have seen in the UK, where anti-vaxxers have stormed the vaccines agency. And that's what we see in Central and Eastern Europe, where governments or other institutions can essentially shape the news landscape to the point where there is much less trustworthy information than there should be in a functioning democracy.
I'll come back to you with a question, maybe how do you assess also the last 18 months of the pandemic in a moment. But first, John, to you, how would you say the situation is compared, looking at general the picture of the media, well, in the UK, in generally, the Western world. And if you look specifically, if you examine the situation today of journalism, what sort of problems do you see? What sort of problems do you most often have to answer to when you teach journalism, or coach journalists in Central Europe?
I'd make a distinction, I think, between what you might call the fairly settled democracies of North America, Western Europe, others, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. That there, I think the mainstream media is still fairly independent, fairly well protected by law, and does still and is able to do a pretty good job, including in investigative journalism and taking the disguises away from ugly corners. I think it still works pretty well. I think in your country, in the even more in China, much more in China, in Russia, a little less perhaps because social media still operates more or less freely. And then other countries in a kind of gray area. I still think there is quite a division between, as I say, the settled democracies and the position of the news media in that, and the others. I don't think it's changed hugely, except that in the last decade, China has got a good deal worse. But Elisabeth raised the issue of social media, and I think that's the big challenge, the big difference. And there, social media, which is free from the kind of self-imposed restraints that journalists put upon their work and have done over the centuries, in order to try to get to some kind of accuracy, some kind of truthfulness. Social media, as she was saying, can be wild. It can be marvelous. It's a great boon in many cases. But it can be wild, it can be dangerous, and it's really, I think, the engine behind what's been called identity politics, or woke politics. And that, I think, is generally a pretty retrograde step, because it has opened up people to all kinds of charges. It's especially in the States, perhaps especially on the campuses, but here too in the UK and elsewhere, especially in the Anglophone world. I think it generally plays a pretty malign role. And it's still, even though it's plagued by absurdities, it's still growing and still becoming increasingly influential, especially among the younger generation. So it's variegated. I wouldn't say there's a kind of a move in one direction for us all, but especially in social media, there's a real concern, a concern of false information, which we saw in January the 6th and elsewhere on more local grounds. But in the settled democracies, I think journalism is holding up so far pretty well. And even in the Trump period, I think the American media, Tom will have better thoughts on this, but I think the American media behaved very well. Probably went over the top sometimes, we always do, but it stood up to a huge challenge from the Trump White House, and came out of it, I think, with some honor.
Yes, exactly, Tom. To you, the question that was part of our debates earlier at Visegrad Insight. Also, the question of how media in today's world, especially taking the American example, how much they are pushed into this partisanship or sometimes activism because they're on the battlefield in a way. And is it a good thing or a bad thing? What sort of lessons the world is or could be taking or is taking from the experiences you've been observing both in the United States and also in Central Europe when we look at media from the prism of combating disinformation?
Well, the media in many countries has been pushed into much more of an advocacy kind of situation. But I must say that in the United States, at least, this started well before the latest developments and well before Donald Trump. Years before Donald Trump, in the United States, there was already a decline in the belief in journalistic objectivity. It was really a philosophical movement within US journalism based on the idea, I think the false idea, that objective journalism means simply reprinting what every side in a conflict says with no regard to who makes the most sense. I don't think this was ever true, but the concept was enough to get everyone riled up and to energize people who thought that journalists and news organizations should take much clearer much clearer positions on issues based on their personal beliefs. This wasn't a totally new idea. America had very opinionated newspapers in the past, and in Europe, it's quite common for newspapers to be associated with political parties and ideologies. But then the Trump administration made everything much more intense. And I think what happened was that a lot of American media became very combative. And yes, I mean, it was great to see them be combative in defense of their rights when Trump made clear he would end the free press if he could. But at the same time, I think there was a harm to the media's own credibility because they were so blatant. Some publications on both sides were so blatant in their reporting and editorializing that it became obvious that that they had very strong views, and people could well be suspicious of how objective they were being, and even in the collection and the selection of the facts that they covered. So I think that if we look to Central Europe, the trick for media in Central Europe will be to be aggressive in defending their rights and be aggressive in reporting the truth, but not to take such a strong, not to mix editorial beliefs with their coverage to the degree where they become viewed as just publicists and pamphleteers and activists, that they try to maintain some element of mainstream journalism. And there are plenty of blogs and Twitter feeds and all sorts of other things for people who are really opinionated. But if a journalistic organization wants to be known as such, then they're going to have to be careful in the tone they take.
Okay, let's now examine a clear case, a case of the last 8 months. How did the global media, or at least Western media, maybe to how much you know about that, Elisabeth, Central European media, how well did they deal with obvious disinformation narratives and tactics regarding the pandemic? What's your take on it? I mean, you've been closely monitoring this, you've been reporting, also alerting about these developments. We've seen massive campaigns of media campaigns by Chinese, by Russians related to the pandemic. What's your take of how well did media do over the last years, and what to be worried about?
I think generally established media did really well, and their reporters tackled this really extremely mysterious disease, including its mysterious origins. They did that very well. But the problem is that took place against the background that Tom has just mentioned, which is the increasing activism of established news media organizations, especially in the US. And that increasing activism, I think, has caused a situation where people don't take established news media organizations as seriously as they used to and as seriously as they ought to on issues of societal, of vital societal importance. And so we got the situation where news media, and I'm talking here again about established news media, including public service, but they reported as accurately as they could about this mysterious disease. But people said, well, no, I don't trust them. And they went looking for information that suited them, that essentially appeal to their confirmation bias. And that has led to the tragic situation that we have today, where, for example, people refuse to get vaccinated on the grounds that they think that the vaccines are somehow damaging, even though EU medicines agencies or medical regulatory agencies, well, the EMA, and in the UK, the regulatory agency, and in the US, the regulatory agencies have all said that the vaccines are fine to take. But this is the result of, I think, established news organizations playing a bit fast and loose with maybe not so much accuracy, but neutrality. And that has led us to this situation. And I'm not saying that established news media organizations alone are to blame for vaccine hesitancy or the anti-vax movement, but it has certainly been a very fertile ground on which these conspiracy theorists can build. The fertile ground being people's lack of trust in established news media. And so when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, I think John has outlined very well the situation, including the fact that there aren't really newspapers or other news media organizations going back generations that people's parents and grandparents used to read. And by the way, on the wall behind me is, I'll show you here, this is my grandfather, who was also a journalist interviewing Mother Teresa back in the 1970s. But if you don't have that sort of environment with news media organizations that have been around for generations, and that people's parents and grandparents have known they can trust, it's obviously easier for the reputation that a news media organization has built up to also deteriorate more easily. And with that, over to you.
Yes, you mentioned trust, and there is an issue of trust and there is an organized undermining of trust in the media also on behalf of the politicians. This is what we've been observing. A Central European flavor here is very much connected to the ownership and the geography of the ownership. I'm over to you. I mean, going over to you, John. I wanted to ask you. I mean, Financial Times currently is not British owned, right? This is not, if I'm not mistaken.
Japanese owned, yeah.
It is Japanese. I mean, was there even an issue? Was there even a debate on the ownership? And how do you reflect on the question also of media ownership in this question, in the debates on media trust, performance, and disinformation?
In the case of the Financial Times itself, the change of ownership from a British to a Japanese owner, and the Japanese owner, of course, is the owner of the Japanese business paper, hasn't, as far as I know, I mean, I'm now a contributing editor rather than a full-time writer or editor for the FT, but as far as I know, there's been no pressure no greater pressure upon the editor and the senior editors than there was before. That's constantly said by them, and I've no reason to doubt it. Both Pearson and the new owner are committed to keeping out of editorial decisions. And the editorial decisions so far, it seems to me, have been in line with the general philosophy of the FT, if actually somewhat gone, if you might say, a bit to the left. Hasn't gone far left, is after all the Financial Times, but it's gone a bit more liberal, perhaps, one would say, than it had been before. It was always kind of liberal, but perhaps a little more accent now, especially on issues we might call social issues, feminism, for example, anti-racism, and so on. These have become themes which were almost inexistent before, and are now actually quite a substantial part of the coverage. The same, to a lesser degree, is true of the other newspapers. I think that has been quite a general shift, if you like, in not just in the media, although the media is very important in this, but in public perception and so on, especially over the last year or two. In some way, especially in the UK, but elsewhere too, is to a degree at least mimicking what's happening in the United States. As far as the way in which the media are now going, it does seem to me that there are a number of, you might call, positive moves throughout the media. But taking into account both what Elisabeth and Tom say, I mean, there are elements there of greater partisanship and so on, but we also have an awful lot more, both in the legacy media and in the web-based media, especially again in the States, but also increasingly in Western Europe and elsewhere, a growth of what you might call well-founded journalism. There's more data being used. There's more journalists becoming comfortable to use data. It's more factually based. There are everywhere now, there are fact checkers, independent NGOs, institutions which check the facts and put out and publicize the mistakes, especially large mistakes. That's really happened in the last decade or so, especially in the last 5 years, and it's all positive. The last thing I'd say on this is that I think that the declining trust in the media, which is especially obvious in the States, but it's true elsewhere, reflects a more general sort of secular decline of trust everywhere, especially in what you might call the establishment, the political establishment, and others. Even those who were regarded as being extremely trustworthy, doctors, police, and so forth, are now under greater suspicion than they were before. The decline of trust has been general. Of course, it's varied enormously. It's gone down very sharply in the media, though not all media. In the UK, the BBC remains pretty much trusted, rather more on the left than on the right, but even so, pretty much trusted, assumed that it reports in good faith at least. But that secular decline across the board in free societies is quite worrying, I think. You could see it in the UK. You can see it, for example, more clearly, really, in France, where a newcomer comes into politics, achieves a stunning victory, and now is quite unpopular. The rapidity with which, the same is true in Italy. We'll see what happens in Germany very quickly when Angela Merkel goes. It's happening elsewhere. The rapidity with which trust is won and lost is a phenomenon with which we have largely been, in our generations since the war, unfamiliar. But it's becoming more the case, and it's not, if it ever was, confined to the news media.
Thank you, John. I mean, both on the account of asserting us that the ownership doesn't change that much, and this has a particular importance for the Polish audience, as we are undergoing a discussion in Poland of how much we need to get rid of whatever foreign ownership to secure media from disinformation. So I'm sure you're aware of that, and I don't know if you have anything to add specifically on that question to reassert kind of that this problem shouldn't be used or by politicians to take over the media. Please do if you want. But I'm also,
I can come in on the
Elisabeth, please
on
go.
The ownership quickly.
Yes.
So since as part of my work, I deal a lot with actually mergers and acquisitions, not with the mergers and acquisitions themselves, but with the threats that emanates by hostile countries or by rival countries can cause harm to our countries. And so I think that the uncomfortable reality now is that we need to start looking at foreign acquisitions in our countries based on who conducts them, not whether they are domestic, conducted by a domestic company or a foreign one, but by which foreign one they're conducted. And that's something that goes completely against the whole globalization that we have seen for the past 3 decades, at least, where all FDI, so foreign direct investment, all FDI was good, and we wanted to bring more money into the country. But what does it mean today if a news organization receives a takeover bid from a Chinese news organization or a Chinese company? And I know this has been the case in the Czech Republic, for example. That's very different compared to if it's a Japanese one or a German one. And this is the uncomfortable reality today that we need to start looking at who the foreign bidder is. And of course, that sort of then creates the uncomfortable reality where the home government might like to say, we're going to stop this acquisition because you are a Chinese company or because you're a Russian company, but we'll let the acquisition by a German company go through. And there is lots of legislation now that has come through in the past couple of years in Europe, and the US already had a bit more legislation. But this new legislation on FDI increases the number of sectors where the government takes where the government scrutinizes FDI takeover bids and sizable investments. And of course, China is very likely to say, well, hang on, you're discriminating against us, but it's against the background of China in particular taking advantage of the openness of our societies that this has become necessary. And we saw that in the media landscape. We saw it, for example, with that Czech bid, but we have also seen it with lots of entertainment companies. And I think the unfortunate reality is that with media being as vulnerable as it is financially and certainly wanting to welcome cash-rich takeover bids, I think it has become necessary for governments to keep a closer eye on who the bidders are, to make sure that our media organizations remain trustworthy.
Beware of the cunning Polish government, because it does exactly use this logic and narrative to argue for establishing a new media law that apparently is not going to go anywhere. It has been, dropped, in order to bring in a rationale to take over American-owned, Discovery-owned TV channel, and to make the steps that are following Orban's development. And as I mentioned earlier, we had in Hungary a takeover of more than 500 media outlets. So in a sense, we would say the government, a NATO member, EU country, would control the narrative and prevent Russian disinfo, Chinese disinfo. And yet we see, again, by the very report of the Oxford Reuters Institute, that we have the messages of Sputnik and Russia Today in the very Hungarian media that are controlled by the government. This is also why
that's exactly the problem.
This is why Radio Free Europe was coming back to Hungary, also to, as I understand, one of the reasons. Tom, would you give your account on that? And would you answer the question, should Radio Free Europe be coming back to Poland then as well? How worrying the signs, in your opinion, would be?
Well, Radio Free Europe did come back to Romania and Hungary and Bulgaria for a number of reasons, but primary among them was that we felt that the space for independent media was decreasing there. It wasn't completely an idea that we were going to do it all and we were going to do all the investigative reporting and everything else. The idea was that by our presence, we might be able to create some space for local independent media to operate as well, that we would help to keep the door open, that we'd do some of the hard work, but we did not intend to replace independent media. We hadn't given up on them, but we thought that they could certainly use a very strong ally, and that's what we tried to be. As for Poland, I suppose it depends on some of these developments of the press law and so forth. But I might say that one of the considerations is money, that Radio Free Europe does not have endless funds, and opening new services in East Europe at the same time that we're facing so many challenges in Russia and Belarus and Afghanistan and elsewhere is not easy for us. I think that RFERL could and should be part of a larger free media coalition, and that others can participate in this work as well. Obviously, there are foundations, groups like the Open Society Foundation, the National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, you know all the groups. I think that one of the problems is that those members of the Free Press Coalition are not very well organized or coordinated. So a lot of the efforts go unfocused. And instead of giving out $50,000 here and $50,000 there, maybe someone ought to just put that money together and build a radio station. There's an issue of scale here, which is not being adequately addressed. So I'd like to see multiple actors working much more in concert than they do now.
Elisabeth, did I see you intervening, and then because Zoom connection is there, or do you want to say something?
No, you didn't. No, you didn't.
Okay, that's also a question to the floor. If there is any question here from the audience, I see one. I don't know if I get someone to bring the mic, or maybe you can have my mic here if you come over, please, and introduce yourself.
Good for you there. I already have COVID. My name is Ricardo. I'm from Portugal, and I work with the European Labour Forum with a podcast, but that's not the thing. The thing is, as the space is shrinking, I would like to have your opinion of the panel and the moderator. Can social networks replace that in a way? So what I mean by that, I just defended my master's dissertation on political debate online. And that starts to be a solution, which is, all right, Hungary, all media is controlled. Poland, there's starting to be problems. Can we move to the online world? Can we have that discussion online in Central and Eastern Europe?
Thank you. So in other words, can we have networked media, online network media, replace the media space to keep the media space going and plurality going?
I think
John.
I think it really is to a large extent. I think the issue is not so much clearly what medium you use does to a considerable extent define the message that is coming out. However, it seems to me that there are some verities of journalism which remain, or at least of serious journalism which remain, and that is that it has to be truth-based, and to be truth-based without getting into what are now endless philosophic arguments about what is truth and can truth exist and so forth. The kind of truth that journalism works on is a very sort of commonsensical work-a-day kind of thing. It is, this is a table, that is a computer. He said this, she said that. I was there, I did a recording, I made a note. In other words, it's very, very pragmatic kind of trade that we're in, and has to remain so if it has any kind of meaning, and if it's going to stand against the wave of stuff, which may or may not be true, may often be deliberately false, that these basics, the elements of journalism, as the famous book had it, the 10 or 12 commandments, essentially are journalism must be done in whatever way it is done, through whatever medium it is done. It must be based upon observable, checkable truth. I don't think that's that desideratum, and that necessity indeed, which underpins journalism has changed. Whether it comes out of the right or the left, if it aspires to be at all serious, it has to have regard to that underpinning of factual truth. If new networks start, they're already there, and they want to operate in that field, they have to adopt the same practices that the best newspapers, the best news channels have adopted actually over some centuries, at least since the 19th century, when accuracy became important.
Elisabeth, the networked and networked media, that is for you more of a problem, I imagine, than the solution, or am I right? Am I wrong here?
If we look at what is necessary for our societies to function, it is for us to, as different components of society, all the way down to us as individual citizens, it's for us to engage in debate, a dialogue, and then to reach conclusions. And if we only engage in debate and dialogue with the people we agree with, then it's not going to be possible for our societies to function. And it's a little bit like if you think of the history of Christianity, at some point the Protestants split off because there was a schism with the established church, which then became known as, with the Roman Catholic Church. And then within Protestantism, there were further disagreements, and people said, well, yeah, I'm not going to be part of this anymore. And then they split off and split off and split off. And as a result, there is this multitude of Christian denominations on the Protestant side, simply because they found it difficult to engage in debate and dialogue with people who didn't think just like them. And that's I think, what we face within our democracies, and that's a whole lot more serious than Christian denominations splitting off from one another, because it concerns the way our societies function. And I think that is my concern. If we can't even agree on what constitutes a fact and have and meet in the agora, as it were, even if it's online, to discuss the fact at hand, then there is just no way in which our societies are going to thrive, because we will become further fragmented and even atomized. And that's my concern. And I realize that it's very hard to establish something like public service in places where it hasn't existed. But surely the best solution for countries is to have something like the BBC, as imperfect as it may be, at least one news outlet where most people can agree that it's basically the truth and accurate reporting, and that clearly is not possible in online islands of information.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And as our time is ending, I feel like we're entering a new area of debate, and so let me ask Tom also to have your final remark, which it is because of the time, on the question of religion here and the question of truth, which seems to be preoccupying also part of your studies on Central European space and media. That seems to be an interesting and fascinating question that Elisabeth brought in. Also the question of beliefs and the structure of beliefs. I'm happy to speculate, but we don't have time. Whether in Catholic countries across Central Europe we have better or worse quality of media, or maybe there's problem with Orthodox, or maybe maybe it doesn't matter at all. What do you think? Your thoughts on closing remarks?
The only thing I'd venture to say about religion is that I don't know how it happened that anti-democratic forces seem to have monopolized the use of religion. Jesus said all sorts of democratic things, and why we do not use religious imagery and religious references and so forth in the pro-democracy side, I just do not understand that at all. I would also add, just picking up on what John said, that pro-democratic media needs to be fact-based. It also needs to be interesting. And I think that that quite often civil society groups and media that comes from them is focused so much on political issues that do not, frankly, interest large numbers of people, or they're at least not going to go to some news medium or blog because they want a lot of political stuff. So we need media, democratic media, that are interesting, that isn't afraid to put a sports story on page one or run a column of jokes from popular political satirists. It's got to have sports. It's got to have entertainment. We just can't be so serious. We're not. If we want to reach out to all of the population, as Elisabeth rightly says we need to do, we can't do this with the things that interest only cafe society. So we really, if the content is good, people will come for it. It will triumph over all distribution and control issues if we have content that people want. And the whole Iranian Revolution was carried out because people wanted to hear what Ayatollah Khomeini had to say so much that tape cassettes were passed all over the country by hand. So let us create a product that people want to consume.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth Braw, John, Lloyd, Tom Kent, connecting to us. Thank you so much for your remarks, and thanks for the interest of the audience and the question from the floor. My name is Wojciech Przybylski, Visegrad Insight. Thank you. Over and out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wojciech.